The air in the Palacio de Silva hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of wilting jasmine and the unspoken weight of Honra. Outside, the Andalusian sun beat down on the white walls of Écija, but within the opulent corridors shadows clung like damp velvet. Isabella Montoya Yaguilar traced the intricate pattern of the wrought-iron grille separating the shaded gallery from the courtyard below. 20 years old, married for 2 endless years to the Duque Rodrigo de Silva's perpetually ailing son, she felt less like the lady of a great house and more like a gilded bird in an elaborate cage. Her husband, Ricardo, rarely left his rooms, his coughs echoing faintly down the halls, a constant reminder of the fragility upon which the Duke's dynastic hopes rested. It was Duque Rodrigo himself, stern and silver-haired, whose presence dominated the Palacio, his every glance a measure of propriety, his silence often more damning than any word. Isabella carried herself with the innate grace of her breeding, her dark hair neatly bound, her fair skin a stark contrast to the sun-kissed locals, but beneath the composure a quiet melancholy resided. A tiny, crescent-shaped scar near her temple, usually hidden by a stray curl, pulsed faintly whenever the tension in the house became unbearable. It was a relic from a childhood fall, but lately it felt like a premonition. Tonight the air was particularly charged. Dinner had been a stiff affair, the Duke dissecting the latest political shifts from Madrid with cold precision, Ricardo offering only listless responses. Isabella had remained silent, her food untouched. She felt watched not just by the Duque, but by Don Alvaro de Perez, a visitor whose persistent attentions she had politely but firmly rebuffed weeks ago. His gaze lingered too long, a predatory gleam in his eyes that made her skin crawl. Later, seeking refuge in the relative coolness of the library, Isabella found herself restless. A faint scratching sound at the shuttered window startled her. Heart-pounding, she hesitated, then cautiously opened it a crack. A young boy, ragged and wide-eyed, the son of her former maid, Consuela, thrust a small folded note into her hand before melting back into the moonlit garden. "From mi madre, señora," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She is sick. She begs." His words were lost as footsteps echoed in the corridor. Isabella quickly shut the window, the note clutched in her hand, her mind racing. Consuela had been dismissed months ago under vague suspicions, and Isabella had been forbidden contact. The library door swung open. Don Alvaro stood there, a silken smile playing on his lips. Behind him, radiating cold fury, was Duque Rodrigo. Alvaro's eyes flickered towards the window, then to the note still visible in Isabella's grasp. "My Lord Duke," Alvaro said, his voice smooth as oil, "I feared I might find Doña Isabella entertaining, unexpected callers, alone at this hour." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "It is not what you think," she stammered, holding up the note. "It is from Consuela, my old maid. She is ill." The Duke's eyes, like chips of flint, cut her off. He did not even glance at the paper. His gaze swept over her, taking in her slightly dishevelled state, the open window, the lateness of the hour. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but absolute. Dishonour. Betrayal. An intolerable stain upon the silver name. "Silence," he commanded, his voice low and lethal. "You have shamed this house. You have shamed my son. There is no place for you here." He turned to Alvaro, a silent dismissal. Alvaro bowed, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, and withdrew. Ricardo was not summoned. His opinion, like his health, was irrelevant. The Duke's word was law. "Gather nothing," he decreed, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will leave as you are. Now. The honour of my house demands no less." Isabella stood frozen, the note falling from her numb fingers. The scent of jasmine suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. The cage door had been flung open, but into an abyss. Isabella stumbled out of the Palacio gates, the heavy oak slamming shut behind her like the lid of a coffin. The cool night air hit her face, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere within. She wore only her indoor gown, thin slippers useless on the cobbled streets of Écija. Penniless, disgraced, utterly alone. The enormity of it crashed down on her, the swiftness of the judgment, the impossibility of defence, the absolute power wielded by the Duke. Alvaro's malicious smile burned in her memory. He had orchestrated this, somehow twisted the innocent plea from Consuela into a damning tableau. Why? Spite? Ambition? It hardly mattered now. The whispers would already be starting, spreading through the town like wildfire. Dishonoured, cast out. The words echoed the Duke's pronouncement, sealing her social death. Panic tightened its icy grip around her throat. Where could she go? Her own family, minor nobles beholden to the Duke's influence, would offer no sanctuary. To return to them would be to bring the stain of dishonour to their doorstep. She forced herself to move, heading towards the poorer quarters, pulling her shawl tighter, trying to make herself invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. Her only hope, faint as it was, lay with Elena. Not Consuela. The Duke's eyes would surely be watching anywhere associated with the dismissed maid. But Elena, a sturdy baker's wife who had served Isabella's mother years ago and always retained a quiet affection for her. Finding Elena's small bakery tucked away in a narrow side street took hours of wandering, avoiding patrols and the curious glances of early risers. The smell of fresh bread, usually comforting, now seemed alien, belonging to a world from which she was irrevocably severed. Elena's reaction was one of shocked pity, quickly followed by fear. Her eyes darted nervously towards the street as she pulled Isabella inside. "Madre de Dios, child, what has happened?" Elena listened to Isabella's whispered, fragmented account, her face growing paler. The Duke, he is a powerful man, Isabella, ruthless when his honour is touched. She pressed a bundle into Isabella's hands, bread, cheese, a few coins, a coarser, darker shawl. "You cannot stay here. You cannot stay in Asilla. His eyes are everywhere." Elena's gaze was filled with genuine sorrow, but also stark terror. "There are whispers that Don Alvaro seeks the Duque's favour, perhaps even a marriage alliance now that Don Ricardo weakens." Elena hesitated. Consuela, she knew something about Don Alvaro, something he wished kept silent. Maybe that is why. She shook her head, unwilling to speculate further. "Go towards the Sierra Morena," she urged, her voice barely audible. "Lose yourself in the mountains. It is your only chance. Vaya con Dios, child." The door closed softly, leaving Isabella once again alone, the meagre supplies feeling both impossibly generous and woefully inadequate. The Sierra Morena, a wild, lawless place, rumoured to be haunted by bandits, bandoleros. It sounded like leaping from the cage into the wolf's den. Yet, Elena was right. It was the only direction where the Duke's long reach might possibly falter. Clutching the rough shawl, Isabella turned her face towards the distant, forbidding line of mountains, her thin slippers already tearing on the unforgiving ground. Current part characters, 3, 6, and 46. Total characters, 7 and 6 and 23. Days bled into a desperate numbing haze. The coins Elena had given her ran out quickly. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache that gnawed at her insides. The sun beat down relentlessly, scorching the dusty plains that stretched between Ercilla and the foothills of the Sierra Morena. Isabella learned to forage for edible weeds and berries, her hands becoming scratched and stained. Her fine gown grew torn and filthy, her slippers disintegrated, forcing her to walk barefoot on the rocky trails. She slept fitfully in hidden ditches or beneath sparse olive trees, starting at every sound, haunted by the image of the Duke's cold eyes and Alvaro's smirk. The refined lady was dissolving, replaced by a gaunt, wary creature driven by the primal instinct to survive. Entering the foothills brought new challenges. The terrain grew steeper, the paths treacherous. Cold nights descended swiftly, chilling her to the bone despite the rough shawl. Loneliness pressed in, a suffocating weight broken only by fear. Fear of pursuit, fear of starvation, fear of the wildness of the mountains themselves. One sweltering afternoon, seeking shelter from the oppressive heat beside a meagre stream deep within a ravine, she heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. Not the measured tread of Guardia Civil, but the rougher, less disciplined rhythm of riders who knew these hidden paths. Terror seized her. She scrambled behind a cluster of boulders, pressing herself flat against the cool stone, scarcely daring to breathe. 3 men emerged, rough-looking figures clad in leather vests and wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung across their backs. Bandoleros! They dismounted by the stream, laughing and talking loudly, their voices echoing unnervingly in the confined space. One spotted the faint tracks she'd left in the damp earth near the water's edge. "Hola! What's this? A little bird has been drinking here." He grinned, showing missing teeth, and began scanning the rocks. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. Flight was impossible. Another, thicker-set man with cruel eyes drew a long knife, testing its edge with his thumb. Maybe she's still nearby. Could be worth finding. Just as the first man's gaze swept towards her hiding place, a fourth rider appeared, moving with a fluid grace that contrasted sharply with his companions. He was taller, leaner, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His face was weathered, framed by black hair tied back loosely, but there was an undeniable authority in his bearing. He surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable. "Raphael, Diego, enough." His voice was calm, but carried an edge that made the others pause. "We have business elsewhere. Leave the ghosts to the mountains." The man called Raphael gestured towards the tracks. "But Mateo could be a spy, or someone lost with valuables." Mateo dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping the ravine. Isabella held her breath, convinced he could hear the frantic beating of her heart. His eyes paused, lingered for a fraction of a second on the boulders where she hid. Did he see her? She couldn't tell. He turned back to his men. "If they are lost, they are prey for the mountains, not for us today. If they are spies, they are fools to leave tracks. We ride." He swung back onto his horse with effortless agility. Raphael grumbled but obeyed, sheathing his knife. Diego shrugged. They mounted and, after watering their horses, rode off down the ravine, disappearing around a bend. Isabella remained frozen for long minutes, trembling uncontrollably. He had seen her. She was sure of it. Mateo. He had seen her, and he had let her be. Why? Survival forced Isabella deeper into the Sierra Morena, driven by the desperate hope that Mateo's band was an anomaly, or that she could somehow evade it. But the mountains were a labyrinth, unforgiving to the uninitiated. Days later, delirious from hunger and thirst, she stumbled into a hidden valley, collapsing near a cluster of rough stone cabins camouflaged against the hillside. This time there was no escape. Rough hands seized her before she could react. She found herself dragged towards the cabins, the world swimming before her eyes. When her vision cleared, she was inside one of the huts, thrown onto a crude pallet of straw. Raphael, the bandolero with the knife, stood over her, his expression a mixture of suspicion and contempt. "Look what the cat dragged in, Mateo, the little bird from the ravine." Mateo entered the small hut, ducking slightly under the low doorway. He studied her dispassionately, her torn clothes, her blistered feet, the haunted look in her eyes, the faint scar near her temple now clearly visible. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quiet but demanding. Isabella hesitated, fear warring with a flicker of defiance. Giving her true name felt dangerous, linking her back to the Duke. "Isabella," she whispered, omitting the rest. "I am lost." Raphael snorted. "Lost? Dressed like that? Smells like trouble from the lowlands." Mateo ignored him, his gaze fixed on Isabella. "Why are you here?" She recounted a fragmented version of her story, cast out, fleeing injustice, seeking refuge. She spoke of betrayal, carefully avoiding names and specifics, focusing on the desperation of her flight. Mateo listened intently, his expression unchanging. Raphael paced restlessly. "She's lying. A noblewoman, clearly. Probably ran from a husband or brought shame on her family. She'll bring the Guardia down on us." Mateo silenced him with a look. "Perhaps," he said softly, still looking at Isabella, "or perhaps she speaks a kind of truth." He made a decision. "She stays, for now. She is weak. Give her food and water. But watch her, Raphael." Isabella remained in the camp, a prisoner in all but name. The bandoleros, a dozen or so men hardened by the mountains and their precarious existence, regarded her with varying degrees of suspicion, curiosity, or indifference. Raphael remained openly hostile. Mateo kept his distance, observing her coolly. Survival demanded adaptation. Isabella forced herself to eat the rough stew offered, to learn the camp's rhythms. She instinctively tidied the small hut she'd been given, mended her tattered clothes with clumsy stitches, her hands slowly growing accustomed to tasks her former life had never required. She watched Mateo, intrigued by his quiet authority, the respect he commanded. He was not merely a brute. There was intelligence in his eyes, a wariness that hinted at a past beyond banditry. One evening, Diego, the man who had first spotted her tracks, returned from a scouting mission with a deep gash on his arm, sustained during a fall. The men knew little of tending wounds beyond pouring rough wine on them. Isabella, remembering skills learned from her mother, hesitantly stepped forward. She cleaned the wound carefully with boiled water, applied a poultice of herbs she recognized from her desperate foraging, and bound it tightly with strips torn from her own dwindling gown. Mateo watched the entire process silently from the doorway. Later, as she sat outside her hut, trying to ignore Raphael's glare, Matteo approached. He tossed a small bundle at her feet. Inside were a needle, coarse thread, and a worn but sturdy woolen skirt and blouse. "You earned these," he said gruffly, before turning away. It was the first gesture of something other than suspicion, a grudging acknowledgement. A tiny seed of hope, fragile but persistent, took root in the barren landscape of Isabella's heart. Weeks turned into months. Isabella's presence in the bandolero camp became a strange normality. The initial hostility from most of the men softened into a kind of rough tolerance, largely due to Matteo's unspoken protection and her own quiet usefulness. She learned to patch clothes, tend minor injuries, even help prepare food over the smoky fires. Her hands grew calloused, her skin browned by the sun, but a core of her former self remained. The careful way she spoke, the innate dignity she couldn't entirely shed. The mountains, once terrifying, began to reveal their secrets, hidden springs, pathways known only to the bandoleros, the calls of eagles high above. She learned the men's names, fragments of their stories, peasants driven from their land, soldiers deserted from forgotten wars, men escaping the crown's justice or a nobleman's wrath. They were outlaws, yes, but their lives were woven with threads of injustice that resonated unexpectedly with her own. Her relationship with Matteo remained cautious, defined by observation and brief, necessary interactions, yet a silent understanding grew between them. He noticed her literacy when she instinctively traced the letters on a discarded proclamation one of his men had brought back from a village raid. He began leaving scraps of paper, charcoal sticks near her hut. Sometimes he would ask her to read aloud reports from captured couriers or decipher maps. She learned he possessed a keen strategic mind, directing the band's movements with calculated precision, targeting tax collectors or particularly oppressive landowners, often sharing some of the spoils with impoverished villagers, who in turn offered them shelter and silence. She learned he possessed a keen strategic mind, directing the band's movements with calculated precision, targeting tax collectors or particularly oppressive landowners, often sharing some of the spoils with impoverished villagers who in Marx. He rarely spoke of his own past, but occasional remarks hinted at a betrayal, a loss that drove his resentment of the ruling class. One evening, tending to a minor burn Matteo had sustained handling a hot rifle barrel, their hands brushed. A jolt, unexpected and powerful, passed between them. Matteo withdrew his hand quickly, his expression guarded, but Isabella saw a flicker of something else in his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps vulnerability. The air thickened. Raphael, watching from across the campfire, scowled. His distrust of Isabella had not lessened. If anything, it seemed to sharpen as Matteo showed her any favor. "She makes you soft, Matteo," he muttered one night, just loud enough for Isabella to overhear. "A woman of her kind has no place here. She'll be our ruin." Matteo's reply was dangerously quiet. "She has proven her worth more than some who carry rifles. Question my judgment again, Raphael, and you will answer for it." The threat hung heavy, silencing Raphael, but deepening the tension within the small, hidden community. Isabella felt increasingly like a catalyst, an unwelcome stone dropped into the precarious pool of their existence. The fragile peace of the mountain refuge was shattered by news brought by a breathless shepherd boy, one of the network of eyes and ears the bandoleros relied upon. The Duke de Silva's men, they ride towards the eastern passes, asking questions about a woman. A cold dread gripped Isabella. He hadn't forgotten. He wasn't content with merely casting her out. He sought to ensure her silence, her complete erasure. Matteo's face hardened. How many? 12, maybe more. Led by a man with a captain's bearing, Matteo absorbed the information, his mind working quickly. They won't find this valley easily, but they will scour the mountains. We move camp tonight, deeper into the Sierra. Preparations began immediately, swift and practiced. Belongings were bundled, tracks obscured. As Isabella gathered her few possessions, the woolen clothes, the needle and thread, a small pouch of dried herbs, Matteo approached her. "This danger follows you," he stated, his voice flat. "Raphael is right about that much." Isabella met his gaze, her chin held high despite the fear churning within her. "I never asked for your protection, Matteo, but nor did I bring this upon myself willingly. I was falsely accused." "By whom?" She hesitated, then spoke the name that had festered in her memory. Don Alvaro de Perez, he twisted an innocent moment into dishonor, for the Duque's favor, I suspect. Mateo's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition. Perez, a snake who slithers in high places, and the Duke believed him, without question? His honra was all that mattered, Isabella said bitterly. The truth was irrelevant. The new camp was even more remote, nestled in a narrow, easily defensible gorge. The tension, however, followed them. Raphael watched Isabella constantly, his resentment palpable. The other men grew restless, wary of the increased danger. During a tense evening meal, Raphael confronted Mateo openly. We should give her up. Leave her where the Duke's men can find her. One woman is not worth risking all our lives. Several men murmured agreement. Isabella felt Mateo's gaze on her. This was the moment. He could sacrifice her, appease his men, ensure their safety. Instead, Mateo rose slowly, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Isabella stays, he said, his voice dangerously soft but ringing with finality. She is one of us now, for better or worse. We do not abandon our own to the wolves, especially not to wolves like De Silva and Perez. He looked directly at Raphael. If you cannot accept that, you are free to leave my company. Raphael stared back, his face contorted with anger, but he saw the unwavering resolve in Mateo's eyes, and the subtle shifts as several other men implicitly sided with their leader. He spat on the ground, but remained silent, backing down for now. Later that night, unable to sleep, Isabella stepped out into the moonlight. Mateo stood sentinel on a rocky outcrop overlooking the gorge. He turned as she approached. "You did not have to defend me," she said quietly. Raphael spoke what many were thinking. Mateo looked out at the moon-silvered peaks. "Perhaps, but justice is a rare commodity, Isabella. Sometimes all we have is loyalty to those who share our fire." He paused, then turned to face her fully. "Perez, I have heard that name before. He profits from misery, deals in whispers and lies. If he framed you, he likely had reasons beyond simple favor." A new thought struck Isabella, connecting Elena's fearful words with Mateo's assessment. "My former maid, Consuela, Elena said she knew something incriminating about Alvaro." Mateo nodded slowly. "Then perhaps finding the truth about your accuser is not just about clearing your name. It might be a weapon." A shared purpose began to crystallize in the cold mountain air, binding them closer than proximity ever could. The fragmented pieces began to form a picture of a man desperate to secure his position, likely through the Duke's patronage. Isabella, meanwhile, proved unexpectedly valuable. Her understanding of noble society, her ability to read nuances in letters or reported conversations that the bandoleros might miss, became a tool. She helped Mateo draft coded messages, interpret intercepted correspondence. She taught some of the younger recruits basic literacy, earning their quiet respect. Her relationship with Mateo deepened, evolving beyond shared purpose into a tentative intimacy. They spoke more freely during the quiet night watches, sharing fragments of their pasts. Isabella's stifling life in the Palacio, Mateo's own story of a family wronged by a powerful landowner, forcing him into the life of an outlaw. The initial spark of attraction ignited by circumstance now found fuel in mutual respect and shared vulnerability. They moved carefully around each other, the harsh realities of their lives a constant barrier, yet the unspoken connection grew stronger. Raphael watched this evolution with bitterness. His loyalty to Mateo warred with his suspicion of Isabella and his fear for the band's safety. He saw her influence as a dangerous softening, a distraction from the hard necessities of survival. The opportunity to confirm their suspicions about Alvaro arrived unexpectedly. Mateo learned that Alvaro was traveling to a remote monastery near the edge of the Sierra Morena, ostensibly for spiritual retreat, but more likely for a clandestine meeting. It was a risk, venturing closer to the Duke's sphere of influence, but the chance to potentially confront Alvaro or uncover concrete evidence was too tempting to ignore. Mateo decided to go, taking only a small, trusted group, including Raphael, whose skills were undeniable, and, after a moment's consideration, Isabella. "You know him," Mateo stated simply. "You might see something we would miss." Raphael objected vehemently. "Taking her is madness." "She goes," Mateo repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The journey was fraught with tension. They traveled swiftly, avoiding main roads, relying on hidden trails. Raphael barely spoke to Isabella, his hostility a palpable force. Isabella felt a mixture of fear and fierce determination. This was her chance, perhaps the only one she would ever have, to confront the man who had destroyed her life. They reached the area near the monastery under the cover of darkness, setting up a hidden observation point on a wooded ridge overlooking the ancient stone walls. For 2 days they watched and waited. On the 3rd morning they saw him, Don Alvaro, arriving not in a humble carriage befitting a retreat, but with armed guards, meeting discreetly with a nervous-looking man Isabella didn't recognize. They exchanged a heavy pouch, gold undoubtedly, and a sealed document before parting ways. Alvaro's companion scurried away, while Alvaro entered the monastery gates. The man he met, Mateo murmured, his eyes narrowed, is known as El Escribano, the scribe, a forger and purveyor of secrets in Seville. What business would Perez have with him? Isabella stared at the monastery, her mind racing. Consuela, what did she know? Could Alvaro have paid the scribe to forge something, perhaps a letter to incriminate her or silence Consuela? The pieces clicked into place with sickening certainty. He paid for silence, she whispered, or for a lie. Mateo formulated a daring plan. They couldn't risk attacking Alvaro within the monastery walls, nor could they intercept him easily on the road with his guards. But El Escribano, travelling alone, and likely heading back towards Seville, was a different matter. We take the scribe, Mateo decided. He holds the key to Alvaro's plot. Leaving Raphael and 2 others to maintain watch on the monastery, Mateo, Isabella, and 2 of his most trusted men, Javier and Luis, set off to intercept the forger on a lonely stretch of road winding through the foothills. They moved like shadows, positioning themselves in a narrow pass where the road dipped between steep, rocky banks. Hours passed under the tense Andalusian sun. Finally, the sound of a lone horse approached. El Escribano rode nervously, constantly glancing over his shoulder, the heavy pouch presumably hidden within his saddlebags. As he entered the pass, Mateo stepped out, rifle levelled. "Hold there, senor." The scribe gasped, pulling violently on his reins. Javier and Luis emerged from the rocks, blocking his retreat. Isabella watched from concealment, her heart pounding. The scribe, pale and trembling, looked from one masked face to another. "Bandits! Take the horse, take the money, but spare my life!" Mateo ignored the plea. "We want information, Escribano, about your meeting with Don Alvaro de Perez." The forger's eyes widened in terror. "I know nothing." "Don't insult us," Mateo said calmly. "We saw the exchange. What document did you give him? What service did he pay for?" El Escribano stammered denials, sweat beading on his forehead. Mateo nodded to Javier, who roughly pulled the scribe from his horse. "Perhaps a little pain will jog your memory." As Javier drew his knife, Isabella stepped forward impulsively. "Wait!" Mateo looked at her, surprised. She addressed the terrified forger, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Don Alvaro destroyed my life based on a lie. Did you help him? Did you forge a letter? Was it about Consuela, the maid?" The mention of Consuela seemed to strike a chord. The scribe's eyes flickered. He licked his dry lips. It was a letter," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "made to look like it came from the Senora, arranging a tryst, and another, a confession signed by the maid, admitting indiscretions, coerced, you understand. He paid well." Isabella felt a cold wave wash over her. Forged evidence, coerced confessions. Alvaro hadn't just seized an opportunity. He had meticulously crafted her downfall. "Where is the confession?" Mateo demanded. "He carries it, no doubt," the scribe whimpered. "Proof to hold over the maid, or perhaps to show the Duque if needed." Suddenly, the sharp report of a rifle echoed from the direction of the monastery. Then another. An ambush? Had Raphael's group been discovered? Mateo cursed. "Javier, Luis, tie him up, we need to get back." But before they could react, horsemen appeared at both ends of the pass, not Alvaro's guards, but the Duke's own uniformed men, alerted somehow. And leading them, his face grim, was Raphael. "Traitor!" Javier snarled, raising his rifle, but Raphael fired first, hitting Javier in the shoulder. Luis returned fire as Mateo shoved Isabella behind the rocks. Chaos erupted. The Duke's men charged, vastly outnumbering them. El Escribano shrieked and tried to crawl away. Raphael ignored the scribe, his eyes fixed on Mateo and Isabella, his expression a mask of cold fury and justification. He had made his choice, betraying them for what he likely saw as the greater good, or perhaps for a promise of pardon from the Duke. Gunfire echoed off the narrow rock walls. Luis fell, struck by a shot from one of the Duke's men. Mateo returned fire with deadly accuracy, providing cover while pulling the wounded Javier back towards the steepest part of the embankment. "Isabella, climb!" he yelled, shoving her towards a narrow fissure in the rocks. "Follow the goat path up! Don't stop!" The Duke's men were closing in, their captain shouting orders. Raphael advanced steadily, his rifle aimed at Mateo. Isabella hesitated, torn between escape and staying with Mateo. He saw her indecision. "Go! Live! It's the only way." He fired again, forcing Raphael to take cover momentarily. That split second was all Isabella needed. Heart-wrenching, she scrambled into the fissure, finding purchase on the rough stone. Below, Mateo fought like a cornered wolf, trying to hold off the attackers and drag Javier to safety. She heard Raphael's voice, cold and clear. "Give it up, Mateo. It's over. The woman has poisoned everything." A shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain. Isabella couldn't see who was hit. Sobbing, forcing her trembling limbs to obey, she clawed her way upwards, the sounds of the fight fading below as she followed the treacherous path higher into the Sierra. She didn't look back. Mateo's last word echoed in her mind. Live. Hours later, exhausted and bleeding from scrapes, Isabella emerged onto a high plateau as dusk began to purple the sky. She sank to the ground, overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty. Mateo, Javier, Luis? Were they captured, dead? And Raphael? The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. She was alone again, hunted, with only the scribe's terrified confession echoing in her ears. Proof she couldn't hold, justice she couldn't claim. She stayed hidden for days, surviving on hoarded scraps and sheer will, slowly making her way west, away from the Duke's lands, away from the memories embedded in that part of the Sierra. She eventually found refuge in a tiny, remote village, nestled deep in the mountains bordering Extremadura, a place where news travelled slowly, if at all. She called herself simply Isa, and offered her services mending clothes and helping with the olive harvest. Her refined speech softened, her past buried deep. Life was hard, simple, anonymous. She learned the rhythm of the seasons, the quiet resilience of the villagers. The crushing weight of dishonour slowly lessened, replaced by a different kind of strength, forged in survival and loss. She often scanned the mountain passes, a foolish, persistent hope flickering within her. Mateo had told her once, during a quiet night watch, "The mountains remember Isabella. They hold echoes of everything." One cool autumn evening, nearly a year after the ambush, a traveller stopped in the village, a man leading a mule laden with pottery. He was older, his face lined, but his eyes were sharp. He sought shelter for the night, sharing wine and stories with the villagers by the communal fire. Isabella listened quietly, keeping to the shadows. The traveller spoke of news from Andalusia, of the Duque de Silva's continuing influence, but also of unrest, of bandolero activity resurfacing in the eastern Sierra Morena, led by a figure known only as El Lobo, the wolf, known for his cunning and his vendetta against certain powerful families. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that the infamous bandolero Raphael, who had reportedly betrayed his former chief, had been found dead months ago on a lonely pass, killed by an unknown hand. Isabella's breath caught. Later, as the villagers slept, she found the traveller packing his mule by moonlight. "You seek someone, Signora?" he asked gently, his eyes knowing. Isabella couldn't speak, just nodded, tears blurring her vision. "Sometimes," the traveller said, looking towards the distant dark mountains, "even wolves find their way back. Go towards the Fuente de la Zarza Pass, beyond Guadalupe, wait by the Shepherd's Spring. Perhaps." He didn't finish, just touched his hat and led his mule away into the night.